Today, I want to talk about the question of why, despite the contributions of well regarded legal philosophers, why have we still, as a global community, failed to recognize various basic human rights? Okay, well, one reason is mid 20th century philosophers such as H.L.A. Hart and Joel Feinberg have published articles that describe basic features of human rights rather than an actual foundation that can work for the discovery or recognition of current, unrecognized human rights claims. For example, the right to a livable environment. One reason for the failure of mid 20th century legal philosophers to provide that foundation is that they were answering a different question, and that is, what does it mean to have a right? From Feinberg's point of view, to have a right means that there are moral principles which justify uh, giving people what they deserve. Obviously, that's not very illuminating and could be regarded in this context as question begging because what are the arguments for what they deserve? And then we have H.L.A. Hart coming from a positivist, a legal philosophical perspective, who claims that rights are commands made by the executive of a country, and those who have the right pedigree in terms of how they were elected or chosen for office. And of course, that's got certain problems because, as we know, power can corrupt, leading to a failure of political officials to recognize new rights. And also, the question is, were those officials elected or placed in power through democratic means? Historically, as far as the history of philosophy, we have been operating under the assumption that the basic foundation for human rights is dignity. That's a Kantian argument that because we have intrinsic value as human beings, and that's based on our capacity for rational autonomy, that means that we have a right to be treated with dignity. So, dignity has been the foundation for many of our discussions of basic human rights. However, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, there's three problems with using dignity as a basis or a foundation for recognizing rights. First of all, dignity is our moral status. It's an inalienable moral status inherent in beings with intrinsic value. Secondly, according to Jeremy Waldron, the claim of rights and the claim to dignity are on the same level. They're correlative. If you have a right, that means you have dignity. If you have dignity, that means you have certain entitlements. One is not the foundation of another. And thirdly, appeals to human dignity have not been successful in recognizing positive rights or socioeconomic rights. One reason, as we mentioned in the discussion of Feinberg's feasibility argument. We can't recognize positive rights, rights to be given certain resources, because we are speaking for another branch of government, which is the legislative, who has the obligation to provide those resources. Okay, so today I want to talk about three contemporary philosophers who have offered new insights into the problem of how can we improve our condition in terms of recognizing more legitimate rights claims. Martha Nussbaum, a legal philosopher, has offered what's called the capabilities approach. And this is one way to expand the recognition of genuine rights. Instead of just claiming rights are based on our capacity for rational autonomy, Nussbaum argues that we have many more capabilities that need the support of the state in terms of providing institutions, laws, and rights. Resources, I mean. Okay, as an Aristotelian, she's looking at Aristotle's political theory, ethical theory, which argues that the state has a responsibility to provide its citizens with the resources for achieving eudaimonia, a form of happiness that consists of a variety of projects that a person is involved in, accomplished with virtue and excellence. So, in ancient Greek philosophy, there's already a notion that the state should provide the resources for its citizens to develop their capacities and to develop virtue. Of course, with Plato in the Republic, he divides the groups of citizens into three classes and begs the question that there are groups that only have one capacity, etc. And they will be put into different classes with different resources and rewards based on their inherited talents. Okay, but Nussbaum argues that the basis for human rights extends to the state's responsibility to help develop all of our capacities, not just rational autonomy. For example, as I pointed out in a recent lecture, Marx believes that our basic human nature is to do creative, productive activity. So, taking that as a lead, Nussbaum says that we have a basic capability for productive activity or for work. That suggests that the state has a duty to provide us with employment. We have a capacity for love relationships, affective relationships like friendship. That suggests that we have a right to mental health care to enable us to form those relationships and sustain them in a mentally healthy way. Another capability, or a few more capabilities she mentions, is our capacity for using our senses, our imagination, our thought. That suggests we have a basic right to education and that the state should provide it. And interestingly, she claims we have a capability for play and recreation, and that suggests that there should be certain restrictions on the length and the conditions of the workday. So, this has been a problem as far as providing the basic foundation for human rights because it's grounded in only one of our capacities. And another positive aspect to Martha Nussbaum's analysis is that it provides a measuring stick, a standard by which we can evaluate societies in terms of whether they provide the resources to develop maximally all our human capabilities. Prior to that, a philosophical approach to human rights might be based on our most basic, central, vital needs, our basic needs. But this provides concrete, specific capabilities that need to be supported in concrete and specific ways. The next philosopher that offers an interesting perspective for us understanding why there are so many egregious human rights violations around the globe, and including genocide, ethnic cleansing, torture, starvation, the denial of a positive right to asylum. So Rorty argued that we don't need a new foundation to recognize these rights among members of our global community. We need a different orientation towards the people that are being denied these rights. Rorty claims that with respect to a lot of these serious rights violations, the people who are undergoing these violations aren't considered similar enough to the perpetrators, the human beings or the persons that are committing the, for example, atrocities. So, for example, the words cockroach was used both by Hitler and by the individuals responsible for the Rwanda genocide when it referred to the Tutsis. So we demonize outsiders frequently and use that as a basis for our callous indifference to their human rights violations. Well, what are some solutions? Well, one thing that Rorty suggests, we need more narratives about the individuals who are undergoing these serious violations of their basic rights. We need new stories. And these stories could be incorporated into our culture in a variety of ways, including them in our school curricula, including them in institutions or mechanisms that involve face to face interactions with different others. An example, ethnic markets run in our communities by refugees with interesting products from their culture to offer us. And of course, recognizing legally, internationally, a positive right to asylum instead of a negative right to asylum. And of course, in our culture, more films, documentaries about these conditions for certain populations so we can begin to empathize with them and see them enough like ourselves that we wouldn't want them to be treated in such a cruel way. Our third philosopher that offers an interesting perspective on these global violations, for example, genocide, comes from Agnes Heller, who points to the problem of evil people in power who authorize genocide, ethnic cleansing, torture. Okay, Milosevic in Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, Pol Pot in Cambodia, al-Assad in Syria, Charles Taylor in Liberia. These individuals whom she regards as evil, people that begin processes of genocide, torture, they need to be held accountable. And we have an institution created just for that purpose, the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So, looking at her argument, she believes that these evil political leaders are genuinely evil. Their doing of cruel, barbaric actions is intentional. Well, who would disagree with it? I recommend the reading of a book by Andrew Del Blanco called, or Del Blanco, called The Death of Satan, in which Del Blanco argues that we have replaced the framework of moral blame and responsibility with that of mental illness. So we would call these people crazy because anyone that would do anything that horrible would certainly be operating irrationally. However, that's if taken to the extreme that you're either evil in the originating of genocide, ethnic cleansing, or you're mentally ill, and that's why you're so irrational in producing these egregious situations. But that's the fallacy of bifurcation. You can be sick and evil, and unless you lack the fundamental capacity for rational autonomy, you need to be held responsible. Her main argument is a historical one. She argues that unless we, in the current milieu, hold these leaders accountable, in particular through the International Criminal Court, the future generations will extend that accountability and blame to us in the current generation. Now, that may seem a queer principle to come up with, the rights of unliving people, not yet living people, but we can assume certain things about future generations. For example, we can assume they want to live in a livable environment with sufficient resources, clean air, water, land, to be able to sustain their lives. So the right to a livable environment on the part of the unborn is based in the fact that in us, in the current generation, have received an environment in whatever state, and that was the intention of past generations, that we pass it on in the same state to future generations. Not that we use up all the resources or produce toxic climates, toxic air, toxic water. Okay, similarly, we can assume about future generations that they'll judge us similarly to the evil leaders that began these uh, rights violations if we do nothing about it. So if we do nothing, they'll know that we let evil people act cruelly and inhumanely. My conclusions in this discussion of basic human rights: regardless of whether we regard Nussbaum's argument for state support for the development of all our capacities, or if we regard that support as a political goal, or as embedded in the Constitution, or just in our shifting of resources, she provides broader and concrete standards for measuring and inspiring our society in terms of recognizing rights. And Rorty provides practical ways by which rights claims can be fulfilled by distant strangers. And finally, Heller puts on the current generation the demands of future generations for accountability with regard to either evil or sociopathic leaders.